Good evening, welcome to All About Auckland. I'm Kane Glass. Today we're outside Hearing Room 1 at the Auckland Unitary Plan Hearings Panel offices at 205 Queen Street. In this week's show we feature the UAGC budget debate and we look at the transport submissions to the Unitary Plan Hearings Panel. But first, the phrase King Salmon has come up repeatedly in the Unitary Plan hearings this week in relation to the Regional Policy Statement. King Salmon refers to a Supreme Court decision in the case of EDS versus King Salmon Limited. I caught up with Gary Taylor, Chair of EDS, and asked him just what that decision means for the Regional Policy Statement.
King Salmon has basically overturned the established jurisprudence that built up in the lower courts that said that the RMA is about exercising an overall balanced judgment between competing considerations. And instead it said that there are environmental bottom lines implicit in the Act and in national policy statements. So you need to have a careful look at the language that's used to determine whether it's prescriptive or not and whether an environmental bottom line applies or not.
And you could see the judge dancing around that language even as we started the process of looking at the Regional Policy Statement. The policy statement is quite broad and it refers to a number of other pieces of legislation. What's the hierarchy?
The hierarchy is that the RMA has got its purpose and principles set out in the sections 5, 6, 7 and 8. Section 5 is the purpose clause that talks about sustainable management. Section 6 sets out matters of national importance and Section 7 sets out other matters. And then sitting below that are any national policy statements or national environmental standards. And it's in those lower order instruments that you sometimes find you go more from the general to the particular, from general concepts to particular prescriptive policies. So that's where the bottom lines may well come in.
And so that hierarchy then really has to be followed when we look at things like the Auckland Unitary Plan. The planners have to write the plan to conform to that hierarchy.
Absolutely. They've got to give effect to the law, and so they need to look at the hierarchy, they need to look at the language that's used in any relevant national policy statements, and if there aren't national policy statements they need to look at how prescriptive the Section 6 matters are. And they're obliged to give effect to both national policy statements and to be in conformity with the Act itself.
And so King Salmon really says that at a certain point there is a line that you cannot cross if you want to put a piece of infrastructure somewhere where another piece of legislation says you can't. There's no fuzziness. You can't do it or you can do it.
There's a lot more clarity and direction now than there used to be.
So, taking a simple example that EDS has been involved in, and where would you go for a simple example of that?
Well, I think you could go to aquaculture, and you could say that because of the King Salmon decision, if I was an aquaculturalist, I wouldn't be, or a planner, I wouldn't be providing or expecting to build a marine farm immediately adjacent to an outstanding natural landscape or outstanding natural feature, because you're required by the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement to avoid adverse effects on those landscapes. And avoid means avoid. Funnily enough, it doesn't mean something else which people always thought it may have meant.
And that's a Supreme Court decision, isn't it? So what's the particular ramifications of King Salmon being a Supreme Court decision?
It means that all of the lower order jurisprudence that's built up, all of the precedents that have been built up in the Environment Court and the High Court and the Court of Appeal have now been overturned in respect of the how you should interpret the Act.
So if we just come into, say, the urban area, it might not be quite as simple as the aquaculture solution, but what areas in an urban environment would you consider, say, a developer would now have to take further cognizance of what they were doing?
Yeah, that's a good question, pardon me, and I'm not entirely sure. I think in the urban, I think the king salmon has wider implications for the rural and marine environments, the natural environments, than it does for the built ones. I think you could say that. Maybe with respect to volcanic cones, there might be some more application or more relevance in king salmon for them. Otherwise, I think in the urban area, you do basically run the overall balanced judgment arguments around, things like amenity and open space and so on.
Thank you, Gary. Auckland Council Transport presented to the Unitary Plan Hearings panel this week. I spoke to Transport's Principal Planner Josh Arbery after he presented at the hearing.
Yes, I think what my evidence shows was that when you look at the transport effects of different urban forms, they have quite a profound impact. So scenario D in the modelling, which is a very expansive urban form, tends to have much longer trip lengths, much higher levels of congestion because there's much more travel going on, and much lower access to employment because people have to travel much further. It takes them longer to get to work, so the proportion of people who can get to work in half an hour is much less. And then also more significant environmental effects because more travel, more fuel use, more emissions, etc., etc. So my evidence was related to the sort of three key issues, one being the outputs from a number of strategic transport modelling runs that the Council's done over the years, and then also talking about the importance of public transport and freight to be reflected in the wording of the regional policy statement.
And from the questions you got from the panellists, did you feel that they were getting it? They got the argument?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in Auckland's transport system. There always has been. Transport is Auckland's big issue, and I think a number of the questions were quite interested in some of the graphs in my evidence and around how we best make use of our network in the future as Auckland grows. And then also in areas such as parking and road pricing, which is obviously a topical issue. So yeah, a lot of interest in how Auckland's going to be in 2030, 2040, and how we make it work with a much larger population and much more pressure on the transport network.
Commissioner Kerry's question, he was obviously quite flabbergasted about the effects of freight transport on the roads going forward.
Yeah, so I think it was the projected increases are very large. That's part of a growing population and an economy that's expected to grow significantly over the next 30 years. I think the key points there was to note that most of that increase is intra-regional trips, so from trips from one part of Auckland to another part of Auckland, and the difficulty of shifting those trips off the road network and onto the rail network because they're obviously quite short, and we need the rail network for those inter-regional trips and also for passenger rail services, and so therefore it's particularly important for the network to be, I guess, optimised for freight and other business travel, which is more difficult to shift onto public transport, and key ways of doing that is, really encouraging those trips that can more easily be shifted onto public transport to do so.
Auckland's relatively dispersed employment does not result in shorter trips. I infer from that there's an awful lot of what might be called cross-town traffic in the Auckland transport mix. Is that a correct inference?
Yes, it is. One further piece of work that I have done is compare the extent to which, say, the north, west, central and south jobs are contained within that area versus requiring to leave that area. Typically in the isthmus, about 80% of people are able to work within the central area. In the north and south, that drops to approximately 60%, and in the west it's lower again, about 45%. So generally, as you go further out, the chances of you being able to work within your local area within a shorter commute decline. And I think one of the reasons for that is that specialised labour is located in highly clustered employment areas, be they the city centre, be they the airport.
How susceptible is that behaviour to modification through policy methods?
I think the big impact on that is availability of employment, and a good example is to compare the sort of inner south, the southern area with the western area in that figure 10, and you can see for much of former Manukau City Council area that they have similar trips to work length as the isthmus, but a bit longer, but not hugely longer. And that's because there's significant employment located in the southern area, be it East Tamaki, be it Manukau, Wiri, etc., etc. Whereas in the west, there's quite a shortage of major employment areas, and so therefore people need to travel outside their local area to access employment. So certainly policies that encourage employment growth in the west, or in particular areas where there's long current average trip lengths, would the census data appears to show that would make a positive difference.
We go to 5.6.3 and figure 13, percentage of trips by public transport. Well, most of the shading essentially occurs between 0 and 10 to 15%.
Yeah.
Is that typical internationally for cities that might be compared to Auckland?
I wouldn't think so. Certainly Auckland has a low level of public transport use compared to your Vancouvers, your Brisbanes, your Australian cities and Canadian cities, and even your Portlands and Seattles in the USA. Auckland has about 47 public transport trips per capita. Per annum. Vancouver has 130.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're traditionally been off the charts at the bottom. We have made good progress though in recent years.
Oh, all right, thank you.
The uniform annual charge is a big deal politically. Set it high and it benefits those in high value suburbs. Set it low and it benefits those in low value suburbs.
By going from 2.5 to 3.5, the trade-offs identified in all our analysis remain the same. The ones that you're making decisions around. The percentage rates changes in some of the tables you have, push them up by around 1%. If you're looking at how many people are changing, they just move across to the right a little bit. Trade-offs remain the same to facilitate your debate today.
Just in terms of least impact on most ratepayers?
The scenario with the least impact over 10% is $250 UAGC.
Okay. All right, and then the second least?
0 probably.
I'm proposing 385. You've got Councillor Cashmore, who's 485, and Councillor Cowley, who's 550. Sam, rather.
Yeah.
At the beginning of the first term of this new Auckland City Council, was the average rate of the amalgamated old councils, was that 450?
You talk about
Previous
UAGC.
councils had quite a range of UAGCs,
Yeah,
ranging from around 350 in Auckland, 0 at the ARC, up to 700.
Yeah.
382 at Manukau.
So they quite varied, but they also had different rating bases. So we had land value, capital value, different differentials.
Some dealt with differentials and some.
Everything was different.
So the staff came, if I recall correctly, so the staff came and recommended a UAGC of 450, yet there was a political decision around this table at that time to drop to 350. Is that correct?
Almost, Councillor Cashmore. The staff observed that the least change was least number of ratepayers facing change was at a 450 UAGC. We didn't make a recommendation as that's a decision for the council.
Yeah.
Like now, back then, there wasn't a level of UAGC you could pick when there wasn't 20s of thousands of ratepayers facing change at -10 or +20. It doesn't give you a solution to the level of change.
Thank you. So a very brief statement, sir, is that all right? So bearing that in mind, all that's been suggested by the resolution or amendment that I've put, and Councillor Darby has seconded, is let's go back to the amalgam of where we potentially were in the first term and remove that political decision to drop it to the 350 where you started from 4 years ago.
I want to vote and urge everybody to vote these down. And I'll tell you a story about my ward of Albert Eden Roscoe. Every election, the Herald calls it the ward of the haves and the have-nots. And what this would do, either one of these, would push the have-nots. It would transfer responsibility to the have-nots who can't afford to pay. So it just shifts responsibility from the wealthy to the poor, and that ain't fair.
And in an area like the West, that is obviously my focus, we are lower value properties in many areas who have had very high revaluations. So thinking of an area like Te Aratū, up around the 50% kind of reval. So I'm just wanting to understand, Mr Mayor, the moving parts.
For the average house, if you look at the table on page 303, so the average is around 750. So if the UAGC goes from 381 to 500, which is close to the 485, and therefore the relevant one to look at in that debate, they'd go probably down a bit. Can't be the average then, Aaron.
Yeah, the average is this a bit lower.
Yeah, it'll be small amounts for the average property because the average property's in the middle.
I hear what you're saying as far as the least impact on the most people and those things scenarios, but I would argue with my 550 UAGC that when you look at the dollar impact of the last 3 years since amalgamation, those that arguably may be set to benefit are those who have been really shouldering the big dollar increases since amalgamation.
What I try to do in this council is be the bellwether. You might not think so, but I try and actually find the commonplace, and sometimes I lead to show you what I believe is the common sweet spot, and what you're looking for here is the sweet spot.
550.
All right, yep, that's good. I didn't interject at a single point during your comment, Councillor Brewer. So, if all of the work that we've done, analysis, had showed in fact that the middle to high value properties were the overwhelming increases above 34.8, then that would indicate to you that you absolutely have to move it. Because you've got the lower properties whose values aren't increasing by the same amount there and staying reasonably flat, with the middle properties and the middle to upper are going higher, and so you have to address that with a UAGC increase. That absolutely is clear. And I was expecting that, quite frankly, and I pretty much admitted to you, I thought that was going to be the outcome of the valuation. And then I probably would have supported bills, maybe even at a push cams.
Wow.
That would be a surprise. But I would have supported it, and I might have even moved it. But the issue is this. The point the bill makes is that, well, why didn't you go to 450? It was actually very touch and go, and the reason why the officers weren't very strong is because it was just about on a knife edge as to whether it was 350 or 450. And the boards were very clear about 350. By and large, most of them supported that. Now, we haven't had a lot of their input on this one. They're too busy giving us their view on other things. But anyhow, on this issue, this is the problem that I have, and why I think that it is probably important to recognise what's actually happened here, not what's gone on in the history of this place, but what's happened here this time. And there's going to be double whammies around the place for mid to low properties. The double whammy firstly, and look, just looking back at my own old area, Otara. The double whammy here is they've had average valuation increases of 50+%. So they're going to pay more against the average. Just have a look at those tables. They'll pay more. They're going to get an increase in rates. Won't be a lot, but they'll get an increase, and it's all pro rata. It might just be a couple of coffees to one or two people, but I tell you, we've had those arguments before. Cans of Coke and a couple of coffees, they don't work with a community. So that's the first thing. They'll get a whammy there. So they're going to get an increase. But secondly, you move the UAGC against the trend. And you go from, which it says not 381 or 485 or 385, it says 250. That's right. And the second one is 0.
Right.
And why is that? Because it's regressive, the UAGC.
Correct.
And we're setting taxes here. This is about fairness and equity. I absolutely would have gone for a raise if there had been a much, much clearer valuation across the city. But there's not. It's all around the place. And that's why this chart ends up looking like that. If you're going to make your decision on a couple of cups of coffee, fair enough. I've done my best.
And it's not unreasonable to ask every ratepayer to pay $550 for those council services which we all share, because that's what we're talking about. We're asking an equal amount for the council services that they share. And it doesn't matter whether you're rich or you're poor or you're somewhere in the middle. The reality is we don't even know that. We don't know if somebody's wealthy because they live in a certain house. We just don't have that information. If you want to be in the business of redistributing wealth, you should not be sitting around this council table. The place you should be is down in Wellington. That's where they redistribute wealth, because those people have the information. We do not have the information. The only information we have is the value of somebody's house. And that's a very poor indicator of whether they can pay. So I'm pleading with you, please give consideration to the amendment that's been put up by Councillor Brewer, because really that is a pretty good indication, and I think of the services that we all pay, all ratepayers pay for the facilities and services that this city provides.
A $2 cup of coffee, I mean $2 to a lot of the people that could have a very big effect in regards to the UAGC is actually quite a bit. That $2 is very much between what they put on the table and what they don't.
It's carried 18-5. Councillors, time to break for a cup of tea.
I caught up with the Deputy Mayor this week and asked her just what the UAGC means and what the sweet spot might be.
UAGC, it stands for Uniform Annual General Charge, and in essence you can view it as the portion of your rates that pays for the chunk of council services that most people have access to. You can't define it down to a series of services, but it evens out the huge difference between what people on lower value property pay and what people on very high value property pay.
So with the UAGC set now at $385, that's at the very low end of the range that councillors expected. What does that mean for council's income?
It doesn't make any difference to council's income, so we set the budget every year in essence from, not quite a zero-based budget, but we work to our 10-year plan, but every year we make sure that every dollar's accounted for and every dollar's needed. So we set the big chunk of money that we need. We then divide that chunk of money across every residential and business property in Auckland, and according to your value, that's what you pay. It's then evened out a little bit by the fact that all of you will start at the lump sum of the Uniform Annual General Charge, and then according to your value the extra is added.
So you mentioned in the debate that Waitakere City had a high UAGC. What was that, and why was that set high traditionally?
So ours was high, and the reason that it was set high, and was pretty much for the entire time that I was a councillor for 20 years, was that we had a huge range of property values in Waitakere, from some of the really low value properties right through to multi-million dollar properties in some of our beachfront areas and in West Harbour. And this was our attempt to try and make sure that the difference between the lowest amount of rates charged and the highest amount of rates charged wasn't thousands and thousands of dollars, because in essence people are still paying for the same kind of services.
I found it curious because here was a council from the left, Waitakere City, essentially with a high value, and I'm not sure what that value was set out at, but here we have the Super City, another council from the left, which settled on what is considered to be a low value. What did that mean?
Yeah, It's become very politicised now. Waitakere didn't really regard itself as a council of the left. We regarded ourselves as a council for the west, so I still view life like that. I'm not very big on the left-right thing. This council is grappling with the fact that we've got the amalgamation of rates, we've got the move to capital value rating, we've got a huge amount of moving parts to the whole rates debate, of which the uniform annual general charge is one part. It's become a bit politicised because if you look at what rates are in their purest form, they're a form of tax. So the lower value properties, the lower rates, the higher value properties, the higher rates. The uniform annual general charge moves the slider a little bit one way or the other to even out your rates. So people on the so-called left would obviously look at safeguarding the lower value properties. People on the right would look at safeguarding the higher value properties. I think if you reduce it down to how people see left and right, that's what it is. The reality is every single councillor around the table wants to do the right thing for Auckland, hence the slightly tense debate around the UAGC.
So is there a financial tool within the toolbox in Council's financial services that will actually take that UAGC and represent it as part of the total rate that everybody should be paying for the standard charges, that the standard services that you get?
We've grappled with that one for years and years and years, Kane, and it's a real toughie. In an ideal world, we could say, look, this is what everyone gets, this is what it costs to deliver, and let's call that the UAGC. Rodney Hyde tried to do it when he set up the Super City, I think it was called the Call Services Charge or whatever. No one could agree on what call services are, and the cost of delivering them around the city is quite different. So what this does is to say, at around the $300 mark, this is a representative amount of money for the services that everyone might be able to get. And then, as I said before, the value of your property defines your full rates charge, which in essence is a tax on the value of your property.
So finally, we saw that the differential rate for business was set in a different way this time, as a proportion of the the rate take. Is there an opportunity perhaps in the future to revisit the way in which the UAGC is calculated? So rather than this annual sort of mash-up, that we set a proportional rate?
I think rates, they cause grief, they cause a huge amount of political tension, and to everyone who receives a rate bill it causes huge irritation, so we can always do better. I think what we need to do over the next couple of years, as things calm down a bit, we get the amalgamation far more settled, we get out of this revaluation bump, I think we need to look at how we smooth that line a little bit between the lowest rates and the highest rates, that we try and do it in an equitable way, but I think we can bring some proportionality into that, and I'd like us to look at the idea of a step differential. We had it in Waitakere. I know it caused a bit of angst, but it did mean that we had probably a slightly fairer approach to rates. I'd like to see Auckland investigate that.
Penny Holtz, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching the All About Auckland show. I hope you found the idea stimulating. If you want to watch the show again or sign up for our newsletter, go to www.allaboutauckland.com. You can follow us on Facebook or via our Twitter handle, AllAboutAKL. Next week we're continuing our discussion on the rates. See you then.